to call fire, fire, fire is not free speech. It's really anarchy. I'm so proud that China is now the standard bearer of free trade in the world.
To what extent do you think that imposition is driven by sort of a racist view of Chinese people?
It's not a human rights issue. It is whether you abide by the Chinese law. The reality is that China is the fiercest defender of the legitimate interests of Palestinian people.
In 75 years of history, 6,000 monasteries have been destroyed and about 1.2 million Tibetans have been killed. This is more people that have been killed in Tibet than Palestinians by Israel.
Come on. You never know what you are talking about. But if you want to cast a dark cloud above China to falsely accuse China with the aim of undermining China, overthrowing stability in China, then you are my enemy.
Don't you think that...
Hello， 大家好，我是小懒。今天咱们接着聊昨天那位厉害人物高志凯先生。昨天刚给大家看了他跟澳洲那边的聊天内容，那真的是逻辑清晰啊，气场叫一个足。高先生以前可是咱们中国的外交官啊，现在成了国际上响当当的专家。你说这中国跟世界的关系啊，他能不门儿清吗？说真的啊，平时看那些西方记者采访高先生啊，那感觉就跟要干仗似的呀，空气里都是充满了火药味儿。就拿他们老爱说那个什么新疆的事吧，这个西方媒体啊，就跟抓住了小辫子似的，天天念叨啊各种瞎咧咧，说到好像咱们中国做了啥伤天害理的事儿一样。你说奇不奇怪啊？为啥这些西方国家这骨子里就带着那么一股瞧不上咱们中国的劲儿呢？今天啊，中东的主持人也是卯足了劲儿啊，把西方抹黑中国的事儿都问了出来，说的那叫一个振振有词啊。所以啊，各位，今天这期节目我敢打包票啊，那绝对是干货满满。今天整段视频啊很长，但是非常的精彩哦，我特别想分享给大家看看。期间的辩论也是非常的激烈。整体呢，大致是分成了3段。那第一段呢，就是回顾中西方关系的演变，从鸦片战争到今日的贸易摩擦，特别是以前咱们中国受的那些窝囊气啊，像什么鸦片战争啊、八国联军侵华呀，那段历史对咱们中国人来说，那心头啊可像是扎了根刺呢，到现在都忘不了啊。现在咱们就来好好听听高先生给咱们说道那段历史。
Okay, recently, I mean, there's a clip that's gone viral of you, and I'm sure you know what it is, in a Channel 4 interview in response to Trump's sort of tariffs, which were, I mean, now I know that there's been negotiations over the weekend, and they're going to be lessened. But you say in that interview, you say, China has been around for 5,000 years. Most of that time, there was no United States, and we survived. Why do you think that when you speak to Western journalists, or when Western journalists speak about China, there's just so much general condescension towards China?
Well, I think China today is the megatrend of the world. Whether you like China or not, you need to live with China, live in peace with China, and get along with China. Therefore, any kind of condescension or prejudice against China is not in your own interest. What I do actually is to help you to have a better understanding of the realities in China. And when, for example, the Channel 4 journalists who very professionally asked the question about China may lose out on the exports to the United States. Now, she was focusing on a very important issue, actually. But however, from my perspective, from the Chinese perspective, we look at very particular episodes in the context of our continuous, uninterrupted 5,000 years history. In that time frame, the United States is very important today, but is not always that important in our time horizon. So we need to be very objective. And if the United States wants to bully China and try to lock itself out of the largest market in the world, then we in China need to deal with the situation without the United States. I'm pretty sure China will continue to survive for the coming 5,000 years. I think historical perspective is very important. I don't think we need to be seized up by anything on the spur of the moment. We need to think long term and prepare for the long term. And whatever we do today on the spur of the moment need to be textualized in that historical time and space.
You speak a bit about history. I just want to sort of go into the history of the West's relationship with China, and we're not going to go all the way back to Marco Polo, or even before that, when the sort of the spice trade has existed, and so the relationship is much older than we like to imagine. But specifically, the colonial relationship and how what is known as the century of humiliation from 1849 just to after World War II, and sort of the Opium Wars. Just just tell us a bit, I mean, quickly, because there's many people in the audience who probably don't know what that's about. So just give us a very brief history of that. Not too long, please, just about 3 to 4 minutes. But just more importantly, how is that kind of, in your opinion, defined how China looks at the West and the West looks at China?
Well, first of all, for thousands of years, China was one of the largest, if not the largest economies in the world. And China has been a very successful agricultural society. The Chinese educational system, ideology, political system were all geared up to serve an agrarian society. However, when the British engaged China for the Opium War, and please keep in mind, it's an opium war. Britain wanted to sell opium to China. China lost that war. And that started the more or less 100 years of downfall or decline of China. I think the big lesson we learned in China for all the unpleasant things happening after the first Opium War, then the second Opium War, then lots of other European and American colonialist and imperialist powers try to plunder China, carve China into pieces, is that China need to be very strong. China need to be on its feet, and China need to achieve high level of industrialization and modernization. And by today, China is the largest economy if we use purchasing power parity as the measurement, and China is the largest, the most important manufacturing power, larger than the combined amount of the United Nations, EU, and Japan together. Therefore, I would say China has learned the lesson, and China never want to be bullied and colonized or semi-colonized by any power in the world. And I don't think any power in the world today will ever even indulge in the fantasy that they can conquer China or bully China or carve China into pieces. So I would say for thousands of years, China was in the first league of nations, and there was a big fall after the first Opium War. And now we have fully recovered, and China is completely on its feet, ready to deal with the rest of the world, including countries big or small, as equal. And China does not want to dominate above anyone else, but China will never allow any other country to dominate above China.
What do you think? I mean, you've been appearing in the media now for almost 2 decades, speaking on behalf of China. You obviously you've been exposed to sort of media circles and powerful circles. What do you think fundamentally the West doesn't understand about China?
Well, it depends on which country you are talking about. If we zoom in on the United States, I think the establishment in Washington, if I may use that term, is worried about 2 things about China. First of all, they worry that China eventually will surpass that of the United States. But the reality is that China is already much larger than the United States. For example, in terms of the economy, in terms of PPP, purchasing power parity, China is already about 130% that of the United States. Now, in terms of many other things, for example, the production of automobile, production of iron and steel, cement, concrete, fertilizers, and chemicals of all kinds, etc., etc. China normally is not only larger than that of the United States, the Chinese production is normally more than 50% of the global production. Therefore, I think people in Washington really need to come to terms with the fact that China is a very impactful country, very large, very important. You cannot just ignore China. You cannot just write China off as if it's a small country, not very important, for example. And the only way, the better way, is to get along with China as it is. Now, the second nightmare the establishment in Washington suffers from is that they worry that once China is larger than the United States, China will impose its ideology, its values on the United States, marginalizing the United States, pushing the United States into a secondary country. That will never happen because China fully respects the United States. The Chinese people are very friendly towards the American people. I don't think there is animosity between the Chinese people and the American people. And I don't think there is real competition between China and the United States because we are 2 completely different countries in terms of culture, civilization, advantages and disadvantages, strengths versus weaknesses, etc. For example, China will never want to compete with the United States in terms of men's basketball because China will always lose. But the United States probably will not want to compete with China in women's diving because the United States cannot win against the China team. So we can get along with each other and complement each other with our strengths rather than, for example, weakening each other by displaying our weaknesses. So my advice to the United States is that don't suffer from what I called Tonya Harding syndrome. Be happy to see China's rise. And if there is any real competition between China and the United States, it will be if the United States wants to impose its values, its political system, its ideology onto China, which China will never accept. Or if China wants to impose its political system and ideology on the United States, which China will never do. Therefore, your God for you, my God for me, and let's live and let live. That will be the megatrend between China and the United States. And I hope the politicians in the United States, those media people, those establishment people will realize that China is not an enemy of the United States, and the Chinese people do not want to be enemies of the United States. China and the United States need to get along with each other and survive together and hopefully help each other in terms of achieving development and prosperity. Now, between China and many other countries, either in the developed world or a developing world, it differs from one country to another. But I'm afraid over the past 10 years or so, many countries have been brainwashed by Washington, especially by those forces within the former United States US AID, Agency of International Development, which really fabricated lots of things about China and mobilized all its forces and coming up with all the allegations, false allegations, if I may emphasize, about China. So I hope countries, including the United States, will need to be very realistic and pragmatic about China. China is a force for good. China is a megatrend to be accepted and engaged with, rather than a country you want to fight against or throw a wedge into China's peaceful rise.
Okay, Victor, you've spoken about a few important things there, and you mentioned that sort of, it sounded like you said through propaganda of US aid, or sort of there's been slurs assertions made against China. We're going to deal with some of those things. We're going to deal with the history of some of the human rights atrocities and crackdowns in China. But before we get there, there is sort of this view on China, that there's almost this view that we need to impose some sort of liberal democracy on China, and almost make China, in terms of how it's governed and run, a secular Western democracy as is understood in Europe and the USA. To what extent do you think that imposition is driven by sort of a racist view of Chinese people and sort of a colonial view that still exists in these countries and the way they deal with all sort of non-white nations? And how do you think that hampers their thinking? But bear in mind, after that, we are going to address some of those things that you call sort of brainwashing and talking points that are made in circles of US aid, and I guess it's other circles as well. But yeah, initially, just how much of that sort of view do you think is just driven by, is it just, as you mentioned, global power politics and the fact that China's rising and has a strong military and a strong economy, or do you think it's also just, there's an element of identity politics and racism?
Well, you are raising a very important and very complicated questions. I don't think there is only one answer to your question. For example, I firmly believe that no democracy, there will be no modernization. And now that China has achieved one of the fastest growing and the best and the most successful version of modernization, by implication, it means China actually embraced democracy. Because if China does not embrace democracy of its own kind, China would not have been able to achieve modernization at such a large scale. Now, the second thing is that, indeed, if you really look at the U.S. Bias and prejudice and bigotry against China, I would say at the core of that bigotry, there is a level of racial discrimination. And they forgot that the Chinese civilization really lasted much longer than the Western civilization by any stretch of the imagination. And throughout the ages, China really made some of the greatest contributions to mankind. And China has always been a very important factor in terms of humankind civilization. And therefore, China has its chance to bounce back and really claim the lost land, if I may use that term, in terms of new and additional and more important contributions to the civilization of mankind. Therefore, for those people with bias, bigotry, and discrimination against China, I think the best solution is come to China, try to understand China, engage in equal terms of discussion with China, try to really be pragmatic and realistic about China. Because your bigotry and prejudice and bias will not work. It will not generate any real benefit for you or for the American people or the people in Europe. It's time to engage China as it is and see both the positive side as well as the negative side in China. Because I believe every country in the world has this combination of the positive side versus the negative side. And if you criticize China with the purpose of helping China to improve and overcome the problems, be my guest. I'll very much be your friend. But if you want to cast a dark cloud above China to falsely accuse China with the aim of undermining China, overthrowing stability in China, then you are my enemy because you are not reflecting the realities on the ground. You need to be brave and realistic and pragmatic in understanding what China is. China is the most important and most successful story over the past 46 years or so, half a century already, and China will continue to be the major force for good. And with the global trade war still unfolding, China will be the fierce defender of free trade. And that will not just for China's own interest, that will be for the benefit of mankind as a whole. China will fiercely defend free trade, as well as democracy, freedom, liberty, human rights. But China has always its own domestic circumstances to take care, and our record will be never the same as yours, but we are moving in the right direction. Hopefully you all are also moving in the same right direction.
那第二段呢，这部分主持人是拿什么人权啦、西藏啦、新疆啦、集中营啦这些来说事儿的。关于这些无中生有的事儿，这西方国家就跟找到了宝贝似的，也是天天拿出来念叨啊。关于这个人权的问题啊，看看高先生会怎么霸气回怼。
Okay, so you mentioned that China will be a fierce defender of free trade and human rights, and I mean a lot of people are probably raising their eyebrows, right? There's definitely economic leadership, which the world kind of has seen, and China's rolling out a Belt and Road Initiative. It's deepened trade ties with African countries, with global trade, even with the USA, and that's why there is this Trump's trade war, right? But many people in the global south and others are also looking to China recently because of the awful sort of track record in foreign policy by Western countries. A lot of it's been spurred by the war in Gaza, but it's also the war in Iraq. Western countries have imposed and intervened and carried out war in the last 4 decades on many sort of non-white countries, and China has not. And that's an element that they look at. And I mean, before we get to now, at the same time, there's issues in China, right? There's the Taiwan issue, there's the issue of Tibet, there's the issue of Xinjiang, there's many Uyghurs. Uyghurs themselves say that up to 3 million of them have been put in internment camps, so they even call it concentration camps. Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International put the number slightly less, between 500,000 and 1 million. But I mean, all the reports about treatment in these camps and what's happening, it's not good. We're not going to go down and break down every single all sort of the atrocities, but what the world's looking towards China for, I think, a bit more than just economic leadership at this time, where Western sort of moral leadership is under question. Don't you think that China needs to be a bit more honest with how it kind of looks at itself now with regards to these human rights atrocities?
Absolutely not. While I have full respect for you, I completely disagree with the premise of your question. Let's talk about that one by one. Taiwan's status is written in history. It's carved in stone. Read the Cairo Declaration and the Potsdam Proclamation, which dictated that Japan, which was occupying Taiwan at the time before 1945, need to unconditionally surrender Taiwan back to China. So Taiwan is part of China, written into history, carved in stone. No one can change that. And whatever that happens across the Taiwan Strait will be solved domestically as an internal matter rather than, for example, as described by some other countries, one country invading another country. And allow me to emphasize, the unification of China will take place during the lifetime of most of your viewers. Don't pretend to be surprised if one day Taiwan and mainland China are reunited peacefully, hopefully, but non-peacefully if it has to be, because we need to really guard against the urges of the separatists in Taiwan, as well as some foreign countries which want to push for the separation of Taiwan from mainland China. You talked about Tibet. Tibet is part of China. There is no single country in the world of today which recognizes the independence of Tibet. Remember that. So whatever problems there are in Tibet are purely China's domestic issues, and I'm pretty sure that China can solve whatever problems there are in Tibet peacefully for the benefit of everyone living in Tibet. So don't imagine Tibet as if it is a separate country. It will never be a separate country. There will never be a Republic of Tibet, for example. Tibet will always remain part of China. You mentioned Xinjiang and the Uyghurs. The Uyghurs are brothers and sisters. They are only one of the 56 ethnic groups in China. And in China, we emphasize that all ethnic groups, big or small, large or small, need to be treated as an equal. So the Uyghurs enjoy full rights with all the other 55 ethnic groups. That's number one. Number two is that, yes, indeed, there are some terrorists, especially involving the Uyghurs. Do you know what's their real goal? Their real goal is to separate Xinjiang away from China, to establish a kind of what they call East Turkmenistan Caliphate in Xinjiang. Now, let me tell you, this will never be possible. It's dead before it is put onto the table. China will never allow Xinjiang to be separated away from China to become a so-called separate country or independent country. So it's not a human rights issue. It is whether you abide by the Chinese law, which dictates that no one in China should ever indulge in any activity which may be aimed at separation of any part of China away from China. So when you talk about the Uyghurs or some of the issues involved in Xinjiang, it's not a human rights issue. It is, if it ever exists, whether there are people with the aid and abetting of foreign forces which want to separate Xinjiang away from China. So let's be honest. Let's call a spade a spade.
Let's be honest, right? I mean, how can you say it's not a human rights issue? Let's also, I mean, I've given you a long time to speak, so let's try to break all of those things down. So with Taiwan, I mean, it sounded like you were saying if Taiwan can't be, reunited with China in a peaceful way, then we will create war and we'll conquer it. It just frankly sounded like that. With Tibet, now, irrespective of if Tibet belongs to China or does not belong to China, or is recognized by China or not recognized by the rest of the world as an independent country or not, or even irrespective of if the majority of Tibetans want to be part of China or not, right? The bottom line is, in 75 years of history, 6,000 monasteries have been destroyed and about 1.2 million Tibetans have been killed. This is more people that have been killed in Tibet than Palestinians by Israel. This is a big deal, right? And in terms of managing what you call the separatist movement in Xinjiang, wouldn't a better way be to sort of put out an olive branch and allow people their identity, allow people their ideas, and sort of allow the people in Xinjiang to be part of this amazing sort of economic development that has been through China, instead of sort of alienating them, calling them terrorists, which honestly just sounds like something out of a Washington playbook and an Israeli playbook, and it's like it's typical empire. Aren't there better ways, I mean, for China to think about these issues than we are one China and we will suppress anything that we think is not sort of aligning with that policy?
Again, with due respect to you, let me differ with you in very significant ways. And let's talk about what you mentioned in three categories, one by one. Taiwan. Taiwan will never be able to be an independent country. And if you do not believe me, just look at what former President Abraham Lincoln did to the Confederation after they declared independence from the Union. President Lincoln launched a war to reclaim the southern states and to force them back into the Confederation. It is not war of aggression. It is not war of occupation of another country. It is the justified war of reunification of the United States to such an extent that ever since the Civil War, the United States has been one nation under God, indivisible. Indivisible. No state can ever declare separation from the Union, because even if, let's say, 100% of the people in California want to be independent, that will not turn California into an independent state, because you need to go through a very complicated, almost a very impossible process to make sure that any single state will be able to be independent from the Union. Now, if the United States is one country, indivisible, why should you ever expect that China should be one country divisible? China will never be divisible. China will never allow any division of any part of its territory from China, whether it is Taiwan or Tibet or Xinjiang. Talked about Tibet. Tibet is very different. Tibet practiced Tibetan Buddhism. Most of the Chinese people, we follow Chinese Buddhism. Now, Tibetan Buddhism, Chinese Buddhism are very more common rather than different. And many people, including me, I go to Tibetan temples to worship, actually. In addition to the Chinese Buddhist temples, we have no problem in embracing each other, not only as brothers and sisters, but also the believers in the same faith of Buddhism. So what is wrong between China and Tibet, or the Han Chinese people like me with Tibetan brothers and sisters? We don't have fundamental problems. I think the problem, if any, was that some forces back in the 1950s wanted to really urge some ruling classes in Tibet try to break away from China. It stopped in 1959. It will never be allowed to resurrect, for example, and anyone inside China or outside China promoting or advocating for the independence of Tibet will be mooted before they really come into...
What does muted mean?
Pardon me?
You said they'll be muted. What does muted mean?
Muted mean they will never carry any weight. They can talk about it.
I mean, it also means that people are also muted
They can never really create a ripple in China. They can never create any ripple.
But Victor, muted has also traditionally meant being disappeared, being killed, being imprisoned, being tortured. Muted also meant that, right? And is that really the best way to deal with these issues?
Well, I think you can indulge in all these false accusations, but you need to come up with real evidence. If you can come up with evidence,
there's been reports after reports for decades.
Now, I can help you to clarify that. But if you cannot come up with real evidence, false accusation,
Victor,
without
you see, I think
satisfying the burden of proof is not a worthwhile thing to be engaged in.
No, look, I think we're trying to have an honest discussion, and I do think that there's so much that the world can understand from China and learn from China and appreciate China, right? But I mean, the premise of that is that both parties kind of have to be looking honest at themselves. And obviously I'm just having a conversation with you, not representing the world or anything of that sort, but just try to help me understand, right? So I've read report after report from independent organizations whose reporting I trust when it comes to them reporting about Abu Ghraib or Guantanamo Bay or Israel, Palestine, or even in South Africa, anywhere. I trust their reporting, right? I do look at their reporting. I've been doing it for 20 years. I do approach it critically, but I trust their reporting. So those same organizations, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, there are others, say that horrible things have been happening historically, and presently, extremely horrible things are happening in Xinjiang and have been occurring for the last 7 or 8 years, right? Now, I think there's a way to approach it to say nothing bad is happening, and no one's going to take that seriously, right? I mean, no one who's looking at this from the outside is going to say nothing bad's happening. Maybe try to contextualize it. Maybe try to say there are better approaches. Maybe the Chinese state have not dealt with this in the smartest way, and the world is changing. I mean, but just denial is just it's gonna create mistrust, because I think the world is looking for China, towards China as an entity that they want to trust, because there is there's a lack of moral leadership in the world right now. What's your response to that?
Sir, it is not denial. It is reinformation of the realities on the ground.
So
Now,
may I ask you?
Do not believe what I do. If you do not believe what I tell you, then try to figure out how to go to Xinjiang for a real visit. You can do an investigation by yourself. I'll be very happy to help you if you really want to do that.
Would I really be able to go to Xinjiang or send teams to people of Xinjiang and without interference of the Chinese government and no minders? I mean, this is the conversation that you've had many times, and it's always the same retort.
No, allow me to mention, if you do visit Xinjiang, your mind will be blown away. You will see a completely different Xinjiang than what you prejudiced against. People in Xinjiang live in harmony, and most of the people there are very, very eager to support the government's policy against terrorism.
Would you deny that hundreds of thousands of people, if we use the lowest estimates, have been put in detention camps?
How can that be possible? I travel throughout the corners of Xinjiang.
The Chinese officials who run the state have said that. They've said we've interned 540,000 people, not Human Rights Watch. The Chinese state officials who manage the state, this is their number. 540,000 people have put in internment camps.
No. You misread the Chinese reports. You need to do better homework. And I hope you will apply a lot of scholarship and seriousness and professionalism in whatever data you read about. And I can assure you, with all my sincerity and professionalism and academic achievements, that what you mentioned is completely against the realities on the ground in Xinjiang.
I wish one day I can visit Xinjiang, and I'd like to understand the truth.
So. Sooner the better.
But I do think 100%, I agree. Sooner the better. I do think we're not gonna be. We're definitely not gonna agree on this. But just when it comes to Human Rights Watch and their reports and Amnesty International's reports, do you believe their reports on Gaza? Do you believe their reports in other places of the world? What's your thoughts on Israel's atrocities in Gaza?
Listen, China firmly condemns the Israeli atrocities against the people in Gaza. The reality is that China is the fiercest defender of the legitimate interests of Palestinian people. This is not only for today, but for decades. And China has always been supporting the Palestinians without any reservation. Comparing China with any other major countries in the world, I don't think you would draw any comparison, because China is unconditionally supporting the Palestinians, whereas other countries may have their own separate agenda, etc., etc. They may even be involved in the atrocities committed by the Israeli government and the armed forces against the innocent people in Palestine. So I would say, when you talk about Israelis versus the Palestinian people, keep in your mind, China is the fiercest defender of the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people. Now, that should help you to better understand China's position in Xinjiang. Xinjiang is part of China. Israel or Palestine are separate, away from China. But the same philosophy applies, because China respects the people of faith who are believers in Muslim and Islam. We treat them with equality and we support them as much as we can. Look at China-Pakistani friendship. Look at what the Pakistani people achieved in their recent air war against India. China has no reservation in sharing its best weapons with the Pakistani people, and only with such unconditional support from China for Pakistan, which is one of the largest Muslim populations in the world, that Pakistan can survive and fully protect its sovereignty and territorial integrity. Now, these are convincing examples to show that China is not an enemy of the Muslim world or the Islamic world. China is the best friend of the Muslim world. China cares about the fundamental interests of the people who are Muslims in the world, both outside of China as well as inside China. Both the Muslim people in Palestine or elsewhere, or in Pakistan, as well as our Muslim brothers and sisters in Xinjiang or many other places in China.
Okay, so I mean, I there's a few things that you mentioned. On the Palestine thing, yes, we've heard the Chinese sort of sentiment that they're behind the Palestinians, and you've articulated it very well here. Do you think, though, that the Chinese government could have done more? I mean, in the last 19 months of genocide, China, as you mentioned, has the second biggest army in the world. I'm not asking for military intervention. That will probably just bring more violence. But do you think they could have done more? I mean, it's really difficult to imagine a future for Gaza, irrespective of if Netanyahu stays there, if he moves out, if whatever occurs. I mean, just how it's going to be reconstructed, if it ever will be reconstructed. It's very difficult to imagine what will happen there. And I understand that that's not your government's doing. That's the US funding Israel. But do you think China could have done more? Secondly, absolutely, China has a lot of friendly relations with many Muslim countries. But I think the issue in Xinjiang is not. It's about identity suppression, and it's about what you say are thoughts of terrorism and separatism, and that's sort of the clash, right? And there seems to be this China behaves with extreme, really brutally and very, very sort of black and white when it comes to suppression of internal state affairs or identity of what the state should be or what you call the one China policy. And from a foreign policy perspective, absolutely, China is flexible, they're malleable, they want to kind of see the world prosper through, obviously they want to benefit, but it's kind of a win-win relationship. And that's not what we're kind of contesting. But again, don't you think some of those amazing tools that the Chinese government uses when conducting foreign policy can sometimes be used to think about the people inside of China or everyone inside of China, what you call sort of Greater China, and just sort of deal with that in a more diplomatic, smart, friendly way where people are given, the freedom to sort of cultivate their identity and not be forced to sort of have some sort of loyalty which the state is defined.
Well, you raised two important questions. Let me address them separately. The first one is about Israel and Gaza and the U.S. role in supporting Israel, committing all these atrocities against innocent people in Gaza. I think from the Chinese perspective, as I mentioned, China fiercely condemns atrocities committed by Israel against Israeli, Palestinian innocent people in Gaza, especially the wanton, indiscriminate killing of the Palestinian people in Gaza. Now, we all know for sure that the Israeli government's ultimate goal is to seize the land of Gaza, try to drive out the Palestinian people from Gaza. This probably will be ethnic cleansing. This probably will be considered as crimes against humanity. And China, as a permanent member of the Security Council of the United Nations and a very important member of the United Nations General Assembly, will do whatever is necessary to rally political forces to condemn the Israeli atrocity against the people in Gaza and to protect the sovereignty and the integrity of the Palestine state. China has called on many occasions for full recognition of the United Nations for the state of Palestine, and China will never stop before this goal is fully achieved. Now, if you look at China's relations with all the other Arab countries, Muslim countries, big or small, in different parts of China, of the world, China applies the same attitude, valuing Islam, valuing the Muslim world, show respect to the Arab countries, etc., deal with all these Muslim people as brothers and sisters. And that's one thing. And I do not really need to go into more details about what China is dealing with the Muslim world, with the Arab world, with the Palestinian people. If you ask any single Palestinian individual, I will not be surprised if you will be told by them directly that China is their best friend. Why? Because China respects them.
So Victor,
unconditionally supports them.
Absolutely. But
now, that's for the international side of the equation.
Yes.
Now, on the situation in Xinjiang, as I mentioned, what it boils down is if you are a Chinese citizen, including the Uyghurs, you need to abide by the Chinese law. And the Chinese law says there is only one China and no one in China is allowed to violate the Chinese law.
But do you think it's realistic to believe that
away from China? So you need to abide by the Chinese law. You cannot abide by the American law or by the British law or by the French law.
Victor,
you need to, as a Chinese citizen, abide by the law of China without violating China's sovereignty and territorial integrity. If you dare to violate China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, you are a criminal, deserving to be punished by law after a due process, of course.
Victor,
so
it sounds like
don't confound the violation of law with
Victor,
rights issues.
It sounds like this is a circular discussion. I keep on saying that all the 540 minimum that the Chinese government
Who came up with the number? Did you count?
Right?
Did you count?
Okay, irrespective, 100,000, 200,000, 3 million.
Did you count whether it's 10,000, 100,000?
It's definitely not 10,000.
Have you employed an auditor to account?
I mean, I don't. We go on reports, and we've spoken to many Uyghur people who are now in London, previously in other parts of the world where I've reported. We've spoken to Uyghur people where we have their accounts, and we're not going to agree on the numbers. And I think it's fine that we don't agree on those numbers, and we are not going to agree that everyone who's locked up is a separatist, who is militant, or is not just someone who's necessarily just trying to practice their be faithful to their identity, whatever that identity may be.
还有第三段，在国际上做生意，也就是搞国际贸易这方面，咱们中国想怎么干，跟其他国家又是怎么相处、怎么合作的？
It's just that, and I think this is the crux of the issue, is that there's so much good to be seen in China. It's really done amazing strides in terms of economic development. It hasn't been in the last 50 years a massive. In fact, throughout its history, it hasn't really been an imperial force in terms of going elsewhere to other continents and colonizing. But I guess, and this is what I'm trying to understand. I'm trying to understand that there are ideas of representation which are beyond what a liberal democracy is, right? But that doesn't mean representation isn't important. And I think that's something that China is maybe still grasping, but it does probably grasp. And I do think there's unfair criticism behind understanding how the Chinese represent themselves, because the values in Western societies about liberal democracy are maybe don't translate. And that doesn't mean it's a bad thing. It just means it's kind of different. And so let's move towards that, right? Let's discuss that. How does, I mean, you mentioned that China sort of is democratic and it could only become economically successful because how does that democracy work?
First of all, China is not one single
I mean, the
party
Communist Party.
system.
The Communist
It's
Party.
wrong to call China a one single party system.
How represented are these other 8 parties in the government?
Let me tell you. There are 8 democratic parties. Then there is a huge group called the Chamber of Commerce of China, which represents all the private-owned enterprises and private business people, which counts for tens of thousands, for example. Then there is another group called talking about this huge collection of people. Now, for each of the 8 democratic parties, I think their members rank into millions each.
Yeah, but how many of those? What I'm saying is, do they have real political power? Yes,
absolutely.
they I mean, on the state level, or not on the organizing and municipality level. And tell us about that. Tell us how that works.
Let me share with you my real observation. Now, China as a democracy is not confrontational democracy. China as a democracy is consensual democracy. Now, you can imagine China
consensual to what extent? Because people do get locked up, people are disappeared, people are put in prison.
No. Again, you are rattling off false accusations against China.
It's
I
not.
hope you
it's
will
not false.
come to China. I will invite you to a cup of tea or a cup of coffee to help you to see the realities in China. But allow me to make that a comparison. If you conceptualize China as a vehicle with 4 wheels, China wants to make sure that the 4 wheels are aligned in the same direction, creating maximum efficiency and productivity. Now, if you imagine the United States as a wheel, as a vehicle, also with 4 wheels, surprisingly, the 4 wheels may be aligned in different directions. Maybe 2 directions, maybe 3, maybe even 4 different directions, normally ending up with paralysis, with dysfunction, with very low efficiency. Because it is kind of internecine struggle against one party, against the other, partisan struggle, etc., etc. So that's not the democracy China wants. China wants to have a democracy with high efficiency, high productivity, aligned up together in the same direction, so that a population like China, 1.4. Do you have any concept about the size of the Chinese population? It's larger than the OECD member states' population combined together. It's larger than all the Western developed countries' population combined together. So if anyone believes that to run China as a political system is easy, come on. You never know what you are talking about. You are talking about the largest population, and you may say, well, India also has a large population. Sure, but the size of the Chinese economy today is about 5 times as big as the Indian economy. So you are talking about not only a very large population, a highly successful economy, very much industrialized, very much focused on production and manufacturing, with science and technology as the driving force, for example, to run China as a government entity is possibly the most difficult thing in the world. No leader in the world, no scholar in the world, no professional in the world should ever underestimate the difficulty and the challenge of running a country as big as China, which in terms of the size of its economy is about 5 times that of India.
Victor,
So be humble.
I do agree. I think it must be a really massive challenge to manage a country like China. It's big, it's grown a lot, and it must be very challenging. But do you really think that allowing more free speech, not even full free speech, right, but more free speech or more independent media is going to derail China? Like, is it that fragile?
No, free speech is always a virtue. I always advocate and promote free speech. However, free speech does not exist in a vacuum. For example, in a theater crowded with people, to call fire, fire, fire is not free speech. It's really anarchy. It's probably legally, criminally liable because you may cause stampede. Is that right? That's not free speech. So freedom of speech exists in a context, and freedom of speech should be restricted by all the other considerations. And I would not be surprised if any country in the world has a short list of taboo issues. For example, in Germany and Austria, you cannot say Holocaust does not exist in the Second World War. If you say that, if you write about that, you are committing a crime. In Germany or in Austria, you'll be put into prison right away. In the United States, pedophile is illegal. You cannot talk about pedophile in your email chatting or in your WeChat chatting, for example, or write about it in a letter. Pedophile is a crime. It's not freedom of speech.
But
in Israel, you cannot talk about non-existence of Holocaust.
Victor, you're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. Every country has its taboos. I think it's maybe a cultural difference, but I just think that there's a lot more restricted things that one can speak about in China compared to what are most democracies now. And the question isn't that, China must have like less taboos about free speech. A very valid point with that. But I know many Chinese people, and I've been reporting on this for a very long time. Not from a Western lens, but from a lens of the global South and from a much varied way. And the idea is that with diversity and allowing pushback, there can be a healthier society. And not just the pushback of, the method. This is a better way to build a car. But sometimes it's like, should we be building a car? And I know that there's a finer line in sort of the Chinese state and how they deal with that. But let's move on, right? Let's move on to
Allow me to add a point before you move on to another question. I'll be very brief. I think let the Chinese decide what kind of society and civilization.
But here's the thing, you're right. But can they really decide?
You don't want to inject yourself into the Chinese society by claiming that you have the truth and they don't have the truth. Be a little bit humbled.
No, 100%, 100%, right? But I think many Chinese people who do look for alternatives are then disappeared, put in jail, and don't have access to that. And what I'm saying is that is a loss, because that there's something that could have been learned there, right? And perhaps that's a loss, and that's what needs to be considered. And absolutely, I don't want to insert myself into the Chinese story, but I do think that all sort of human societies can learn from each other, and we should try to do that. Absolutely,
of course.
Sort of his consolidation of power, but without doubt, I would disagree from an outsider's perspective on how he sort of consolidated power. But he has driven China forward. Economically and that's a major deal, because without economic freedom, people are always limited in what they can sort of achieve in life, and that's important. So I mean, it's a double-edged sword. But what do you think his legacy, what kind of legacy do you think?
Over the past 13 years or so, and for many years to come into the future, China needs a leader who is very wise, very courageous, very tough, able to stabilize the situation inside China, and able to deal with whatever adversaries in the outside world, and always stand firm on matters of principle as far as China is concerned, protecting China's sovereignty and territorial integrity, and to use a more recent term that is becoming wild in China, never kneel down. Tough, he's very wise, very courageous, and very much focused on promoting what we call the commonwealth of the interests of mankind as a whole. Because by promoting Belt and Road, by promoting Shanghai Cooperation Organization, by promoting the framework of BRICS, you can see that China really wants to share the benefits of its modernization and development with as many other countries as possible.
Inevitable that as we move forward, I mean, year by year and decade by decade, China will become more central for now into the global story, because China is, as you mentioned, is a very big population, second just to India, and that's just recent, and will soon be the biggest economy in the world, even without purchasing power parity, right? At some point. So the Chinese story is only getting bigger. What things do you think, and I mean, and I'm trying to be really honest about this, but do you think there's things that China needs to improve or change to get more global trust as it moves more closer to the center of really global power?
Well, whichever person in the world which has some good advice for China to better present itself in the world, be very much welcomed. You will be a hero if you can come up with real concrete proposals that China can really adopt to better communicate with the rest of the world. However, false accusations will not work, and try to create falsehood against China will also not work. I think China has been very much focused on delivering goods over the past 46 or 47 years. China is not very good at telling a story like sometimes the people in India have been doing. They are very good at Bollywood movies, etc. Most of the Chinese movies are not that much of a blockbuster, even though there are more recent creations which are really shattering the expectations. And I would say China needs to think more about China and the rest of the world, because China is so big, the internal gravity is such that normally if you work or live or operate in China, you are completely absorbed by this domestic internal gravity, is that right? You rarely has more time to think about outside of China. So I think the Belt and Road Initiative really emancipates the Chinese people and enabled and incentivized the Chinese people to think constantly about China versus the rest of the world. We are just starting. The Belt and Road Initiative started more or less in 2012, 2013. It's only about a decade old, and we need to be engaging with the rest of the world collectively, as well as with each of the countries in the world, much more so intimately, so that both the rest of the world and China, both the people in the world and the Chinese people, will understand each other better. We can chat, we can share stories, family stories, etc. more, and the world will become a merrier place and a happier place, because I truly believe China, being one of the most important political force in the world, is a force for good, is a force for free trade, it's a force for development, force for peace and stability, which will be welcomed by the rest of the world.
Okay, just a final question. There's a lot of people probably seeing this, and people who may see this later on, and they have deep mistrust in both Western powers, the US, the UK, the EU, and a lot of mistrust in the Chinese. What is your message to them?
Well, I think the real choice for the people in the world of today is not between China versus the United States, or China versus Britain, or China versus the EU. The real choice is between whether the United States or EU or Britain or China is doing the right thing or the wrong thing. Now, if the United States is doing the right thing, why don't you want to follow in their footsteps? If the United States is doing the wrong thing, why do you want to be tempted in following that footstep? Now, it's the same thing for EU or France or for Britain or for Germany or for any other country, including for China. If China does the right thing, why don't you want to work with China? If China is doing the wrong thing, never follow China's leadership. I will urge you, don't follow China's leadership or footstep. So the real choice is whether some country is doing the right thing or the wrong thing. And you need to use your own brain to come up with your own judgment. Now, in the more recent global trade war, allow me to emphasize, the United States is doing absolutely the wrong thing in launching this global trade war, or the tariff war, against not only China, but the rest of the world. China is doing absolutely the right thing in defending free trade and in absolutely measuring up against the United States in terms of, for example, retaliation against the one-sided maximum tariffs against China. This is the reality. We all need to fully understand what China is doing versus what the United States is doing. The United States is wrong in launching the trade war. China is doing the right thing in defending free trade. I'm so proud that China is now the standard bearer of free trade in the world.
Victor Gao, thank you so much. I've thoroughly enjoyed speaking with you, and it's been a pleasure.
有些西方国家看咱们中国就跟戴着有色眼镜似的，明明咱们中国做的挺好的，他们非得挑刺儿找茬，这根本就是双标啊，不厚道。而且高先生还特别自豪地说，咱们中国现在要当全世界搞自由贸易的领头羊了。这话一听，是不是感觉咱们中国现在腰杆子更硬了，也更有担当了，想带着全世界一起发家致富？当然了啊，这中间肯定还会有一些不同的意见，一些摩擦。但是通过今天的谈话啊，我觉得咱们至少能清楚一些，咱们中国啊是怎么想的，咱们想要一个什么样的世界。说白了，国家与国家之间相处啊，就像咱们邻里街坊一样，多一份理解，少一些误会，才能和和气气的往前走。大家说是不是这个理儿呢？这场对话也许一下子没法把所有的误会都解开，但是至少能让我们听到不同的声音，对吧？这样咱们看问题也会更加的全面，更清楚，对不对？好了，今天的视频就到这儿啦，希望你们能看得过瘾。我是小懒，我们下期再见。